stand on the contested ridge with me in the late afternoon of the 20th of June, 451. Around you, the fighting has ground on for hours, back and forth across high ground that both sides understand, without needing to say it aloud, will decide everything. To your left, men fighting under Roman command. To your right, Visigothic warriors, sworn to a king who within living memory was Rome's enemy as often as its ally. You are standing in an alliance that should not exist by the ordinary logic of this century, forged specifically because what is advancing from the other side of that ridge is worse than any grudge these two peoples ever held against each other. What does it take to make Rome's oldest enemies fight and die beside it against something even Rome cannot face alone? Before going further, one persistent myth deserves correcting immediately because it shapes how nearly every popular account frames the man on the other side of this ridge. Attila is remembered today above almost anything else by a single Latin epithet, Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God. It sounds like exactly the kind of title contemporaries would have used to describe him in terror as his armies approached. It isn't. The formal Latin phrase does not appear in any source from Attila's own lifetime or even the century that followed it. The earliest confirmed use of that specific expression dates to the year 1387, nearly 1,000 years after Attila died. The closest genuinely contemporary description, from the historian Jordanes, calls him something closer to a man born to shake the nations, a fearsome enough label on its own, but a different thing entirely from the medieval Christian invention that would eventually eclipse it in popular memory. Nearly everything you have ever heard called Attila's contemporary reputation was actually built centuries after his death. If you want the real story of how that alliance formed and what it actually decided, subscribe now. There's more of exactly this waiting for you. To understand why this coalition exists at all, you have to start with the Roman general holding it together and with a piece of his own biography that reads less like a career summary and more like a hostage negotiation. As a young man, Flavius Aetius had been sent away twice as a diplomatic hostage, first to the Visigoths, then to the Huns, spending real formative years living among the very peoples Rome would later need him to fight or ally with. Among the Huns specifically, Aetius did not simply survive captivity. He built genuine personal relationships within their leadership, relationships that would shape the rest of his career in ways no purely Roman upbringing could have. He understood how the Huns made decisions, how their leadership actually functioned, in a way almost no other Roman commander of his generation could claim, and he would go on to use Hunnic mercenary forces himself at various points in his career, on Rome's behalf, against other enemies entirely. A career built, in no small part, on treating the boundary between Roman and barbarian as far more flexible and negotiable than most of his contemporaries were willing to admit. This is worth sitting with, because it means the general who eventually assembled the coalition to stop Attila was, by background and personal experience, one of the least conventionally Roman military leaders of his entire era, a man whose greatest strategic asset was precisely the years he spent outside Rome, among the people Rome called its enemies. That understanding became urgently relevant because of a diplomatic incident, strange enough that, if it weren't so thoroughly documented, would sound invented. Honoria, sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, found herself facing an arranged marriage she desperately wanted to avoid, and in a bid to escape it, sent a ring to Attila, the ruler of the Huns, appealing to him for help. Whether Attila genuinely believed this constituted a marriage proposal, or simply recognized an extraordinarily useful pretext when one landed in his lap, he responded by demanding Honoria's hand in marriage, and, along with her, half the territory of the Western Roman Empire as a dowry. When Valentinian refused, Attila had exactly the justification he needed. In early 451, he crossed the Rhine into Gaul at the head of a massive army, and Roman Gaul suddenly faced a threat no single power in the region could hope to stop alone. This is where Aetius's years among the Huns paid their strangest dividend. Rather than face Attila with Roman forces alone, hopelessly outmatched, Aetius negotiated an alliance with Theodoric I, king of the Visigoths, a people Rome had fought, made uneasy peace with, and fought again across the better part of a century. Old hatreds were set aside, not out of sudden goodwill, but out of a shared, urgent recognition that whatever else divided Romans and Visigoths, neither could survive Attila's advance separately. The coalition Aetius assembled was not made up solely of Romans and Visigoths either, and one further member of it reveals just how fragile trust actually ran within this alliance. Sangiban, king of the Alans, brought his own horsemen to the coalition, but his loyalty was genuinely in doubt. There is evidence he had earlier come close to opening the gates of a besieged city to Attila's forces rather than resist. Rather than exclude him and lose his cavalry entirely, Aetius made a calculated placement instead. He positioned Sangiban and his alans directly in the center of the allied battle line, flanked by Roman and Visigothic forces on either side, in a position specifically chosen to make defection or flight physically impossible without fighting through his own supposed allies first. Whatever Sangiban's private loyalties actually were that day, his Alan horsemen fought hard in the center and suffered heavy losses alongside everyone else. A coalition held together, in at least one case, not by shared purpose but by the simple physical impossibility of leaving it. We should pause here on the actual size of the forces about to collide, because this is a story ancient chroniclers could not resist inflating. Contemporary sources describing Attila's invading army throw around numbers as high as 300,000 to 700,000 men, figures modern historians regard as wildly unrealistic given the logistics of moving, feeding, and supplying an army that size through the Gaul of this period. More sober modern estimates place the actual combined Hunnic and allied force somewhere in the range of 50 to 100,000, still an enormous army by the standards of the age, but nowhere close to the almost mythical scale later writers assigned it. If the idea that a Roman general's own childhood as a hostage among his eventual enemies became the exact skill set that saved Gaul interests you as much as it interests us, our members get more of exactly this kind of human-scale strategic history, first and uncut. It's there whenever you want to go further with us. The battle itself centered on control of high ground, a ridge dominating the surrounding plain, the kind of terrain feature that in ancient warfare could decide an entire engagement simply by controlling what each side could see and how each side could maneuver. Both commanders appear to have recognized its value at roughly the same moment, and what followed was less a single dramatic charge than an extended, grinding contest for that single piece of elevated ground, units feeding into the fight and being pulled back exhausted, replaced by others, the kind of attritional close-quarters combat that rarely produces the clean, decisive moments later storytelling prefers, but that consumed real hours and real lives all the same. Fighting for that ridge occupied most of the afternoon, brutal and grinding, neither side able to force a quick decision, both armies committing more of their strength as the hours wore on, and the stakes of losing that particular stretch of high ground became clearer to everyone fighting over it. Now feel the ground shift beneath the fighting itself. On the Roman right, Theodoric's Visigothic warriors finally break through the line facing them, and the breach does not simply open a gap, it swings around, outflanking Attila's own center from the side his formation was never built to defend against. You can feel the shape of the entire battle change in that moment, the pressure that has been building all afternoon suddenly finding release, allied horsemen pouring through ground that was solid enemy line only minutes before. Somewhere in that surge, King Theodoric himself is thrown from his horse in the chaos of the fighting and killed, trampled or cut down amid his own advancing warriors before anyone around him can fully register what has happened. One of the most senior casualties either side will suffer that day, cut down not in some isolated skirmish but in the exact maneuver that turns the entire battle in his own side's favor, a bitter irony his own men have no time to absorb with the fighting still raging around them. The Huns, facing collapse on a flank they cannot recover, begin falling back toward the shelter of their own camp, and the ridge that consumed an entire afternoon's fighting is, by evening, firmly in the coalition's hands. By any reasonable measure, this is a decisive victory, the first major defeat of Attila's career and the end of his advance into Gaul. Ancient sources, predictably, could not resist attaching an equally staggering casualty count to a battle already inflated in troop numbers. The historian Jordanes places the dead at 165,000, not even counting a separate skirmish fought before the main battle. Set against modern, far more conservative estimates of the total forces actually engaged, a figure like that simply does not hold up to scrutiny. Whatever the true toll, and it was almost certainly catastrophic by any standard ancient chroniclers reaching for numbers meant to convey apocalyptic scale rather than precise accounting. What happens next is where this battle's legacy gets genuinely complicated, and where historians still argue rather than agree. Aetius does not press his advantage to destroy Attila's retreating, wounded army. He lets the Huns withdraw rather than pursuing them to annihilation, a choice that has puzzled and divided historians for as long as this battle has been studied. One reading points back to Aetius's own history, those years spent among the Huns as a young hostage, and wonders whether some genuine personal reluctance shaped a decision to spare an enemy he had once, in some real sense, lived among. The more widely favoured reading among modern historians is considerably colder and more calculating, that Aetius understood a completely destroyed Hunnic power would leave his newly won Visigothic allies as the single dominant force in the region, with no counterweight left to check their own ambitions in Gaul. A weakened but surviving Hunnic threat in this reading served Roman interests as a kind of balancing weight, even as an ally's blood had just been spilled defeating it. We cannot tell you with certainty which motive actually drove the decision, sentiment or statecraft, and any account that claims full confidence on this point is asserting more than the evidence allows. There is a third possibility worth naming plainly alongside the two more common readings, one that has nothing to do with either sentiment or grand strategy. Aetius's own coalition army was exhausted too. A force built from Romans, Visigoths, a wavering contingent of Alans, and other allied groups who had never fought together before this campaign, had just survived a brutal, grinding afternoon of close combat, and had lost its own, most senior allied leader, Theodoric, in the process. Pressing a battered, patchwork coalition into an aggressive pursuit of a still dangerous retreating army carried its own very real risks of turning a hard-won victory into a costly, drawn-out disaster. Sometimes the simplest explanation, an army too spent to press its advantage further, deserves as much consideration as the more dramatic theories of calculated betrayal or old loyalty. Whatever Aetius's true reasoning, this battle was not the last time Attila's name would trouble Roman territory. The following year, 452, he invaded Italy itself, sacking cities across the north of the peninsula before, according to a tradition recorded by multiple ancient sources, turning back after a meeting with Pope Leo I outside Rome. What was actually said in that meeting, and how much genuine credit belongs to papal diplomacy rather than disease, supply shortages, or news of an Eastern Roman counterattack against Hunnic territory, is a question with its own complicated evidence, and a separate campaign with its own famous episodes that belongs to its own telling, rather than a rushed footnote here. What Chalons actually decided was narrower, and in its own way more remarkable, that the advance into Gaul specifically would go no further, stopped not by Rome alone, standing as it once had at the height of its power, but by a fragile, purpose-built coalition of a declining empire, and the very peoples it had spent generations trying to subdue. So think back to that ridge, to the fighting stretching through an entire afternoon before the flank finally broke. You were never simply watching a Roman army defend its territory that day. You were watching the last great coordinated Western Roman military effort of its kind, and you were watching it succeed only because a general who had once been a hostage among his own enemies understood how to turn that captivity into the exact alliance Rome could no longer build any other way. Theodoric died defending ground his people, and Rome's had spent a century fighting each other over instead. Attila walked away, battered but alive, for reasons no single surviving account can fully settle. What remains, once the inflated numbers and the uncertain motives are set aside, is a battle that did not save Rome the way earlier generations might have imagined salvation. Not through unquestioned Roman strength, standing alone and triumphant the way it once had at the height of its power centuries earlier, but through an alliance built from old enemies, an untrustworthy king positioned so he had no choice but to fight, and a general whose greatest qualification was the years he spent as a captive rather than a conqueror. Rome by 451 could no longer save Gaul on its own terms. It could only save it by admitting that, and building something more fragile, more improvised, and ultimately more effective than pure Roman strength alone could have managed. That, more than any single tactical maneuver on that ridge, is the actual legacy of this battle, proof that by the middle of the 5th century, the empire's survival increasingly depended not on the myth of its own invincibility, but on its willingness to share the fight with the very peoples it had once called its enemies. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the alliances built from unlikely necessity, the numbers checked against what the evidence can actually support, the decisions historians still can't fully agree on, there's another one waiting for you. Click it and walk with us further into the shadow.